Hello, everybody, again. I am joined today by Shruggie.
Hello,
And
welcome.
we are discussing religion and artificial intelligence, or
Yes,
artificial intelligence and religion.
and we purposely didn't prepare at all.
Nothing. So
Yeah,
this is also going to function as sort of a Q&A, but we're just going to kind of chat. And if you guys have anything you want us to talk about or you have any questions, feel free. There's not going to be a set question period. We'll just kind of do this on the fly. So,
yes,
yeah.
but there's reason to this, and that's basically that we have a lot of conversations like this IRL, and I don't know. It's often we've been like, "Dang, I wish we were recording that. Dang, I wish we could like post that on YouTube or something." So, and it helps that we're in totally different areas of study, so we have interests that converge on the same topics, but I don't know. I think
And you're in what's your sort of educational trajectory?
right. Okay, so yeah, so I guess I did my undergrad in computer science and psychology, and then I snuck into philosophy. So now I'm doing a PhD, and yeah, I guess I'm interested in philosophy of psychology, philosophy of artificial intelligence, um, topics like that. I mean, there are a whole lot of names you could give it: philosophy of mind, philosophy of cognitive science. They're all sort of true. Which of those labels you use kind of depends on your, I don't know, uh, taste or ideology or something. Um, but yeah, so I'm working on, and we were sort of in a stream ostensibly to discuss. It was supposed to be a reaction video to some other sort of. It was a sort of political video, but we kind of just went off on a bunch of other interesting topics. But I feel like that stream, most of the attention was people who were like watching. They were kind of there for
There's mostly people who are upset about the fact that we were. I don't know. It's not even really correct to say we're critiquing Endeavor's video. There just wasn't anything there. It was so underspecified and just too broad. It wasn't great, and it was boring, and we sort of not really rage quit, but we gave up on it about 3/4 of the way through, or somewhere about.
Yeah, and I guess we sort of stand in a different position when it comes to the character of our lack of enthusiasm for that sort of thing. For you, you're studying political science and political philosophy, so you have this sort of special angst about how these people are pontificating about political science and they're doing a terrible job. And I guess maybe I would feel some kind of way if people were doing that about philosophy of mind or artificial intelligence or in my department, but I haven't really seen any of that. Like I, so
Well,
I guess,
I mean, you yourself have encountered this though. Like you've. Thank you. Sorry, my coffee has just arrived. Thank you so much. Very professional. You've argued about the possibility of doing AI research in a strong sense, in the sense of actually constructing something that has the psychological qualities of a human being. And
yeah,
you've met pushback very much along those political lines, haven't you? Or those religious lines, I should say.
yes, I have. Yeah, so I mean, I guess I hope people don't mind if I recapitulate some of what I said in that other stream, because I wouldn't expect anybody to watch that other stream to pull out this stuff.
Yeah.
But it was a good conversation. Don't get me wrong. But it was 2 hours long, so this one's only going to be 1 hour long. So great. So I'm interested in what I'm calling person building projects. So these would be basically attempts to make beings that have the capacities that make us persons, right? So here's what you do. You give a specification of what it is about humans that matters, right? That makes us persons, that makes us, for instance, moral agents, moral patients, so we can be wronged and we can wrong other people, political members of political communities, and indeed, from a religious angle, it would be to create beings with the same kind of So insofar as there's a religious impulse in us, and insofar as that's essential to the kinds of beings we are, that's the sort of thing that we would need to replicate in these other creatures. So anyways, I'm interested in kind of exploring what are the aspects of ourselves that matter, and what kinds of attributes would an artificial being need to have to be in the same standing as us. So that's the nature of that project. And so, right. So there's one sort of pursuit, which is just to identify and describe that project. And then there's another pursuit, which is to ask, okay, so we have this idea of a possible pursuit that we could undertake. Now, what are good reasons to do it? And what are bad reasons to do it? And in fact, are there good reasons to do it? Most of the reasons that you sort of see in science fiction for creating beings kind of like this, well, people create robots to do stuff for them, right? And sometimes, like, probably the more noble motivations that these fictional creators of artificial persons tend to have, the most noble ones tend to be still not that noble. So they tend to be something like, well, we're trying to advance scientific knowledge, right? We're engaged in this scientific project of understanding ourselves. This is just psychology, but it's how we do psychology is we make more beings like us, because there's this quote that I sort of agree with and sort of don't, which is attributed to various people. You don't know how something works until you can make one. So that is probably the most noble, familiar motivation for trying to create artificial persons. But it's still an instrumental reason. It's still for the purpose of you getting knowledge. And it's not, you brought up Kant in the other stream. That was spot on. Kant says, you should never treat other people merely as a means. So if you're bringing these beings into existence, and not treating them in some way as ends in themselves, you're doing something wrong. So yeah, that's in a nutshell kind of what I'm after with the artificial persons stuff.
Why do we specify the word persons?
Why persons? Well, so there's a lot of talk about other things. People care a lot about artificial general intelligence, for instance. That's a term that gets thrown around. What's artificial general intelligence? Well, basically, it's instrumental reason applied to arbitrary domains, more or less. It's give the thing a task, can it find a way to complete it or something? So that's not what I'm after, because you can see how that. Okay, so right, so we just described the notion of intelligence or of general intelligence. Now let's describe some other characteristics that we think matter. So we are beings with a kind of, where do I want to start here? So I'll start where I started in the other stream. So we're beings that care about things in the world. We care about projects that we undertake. We care about other people and our relationships with them. And that motivates and drives our actions. We sort of strive to protect and defend the things we love. So this capacity to care about things, is that something that's encompassed in the notion of a general intelligence? Well, I don't think it is. I think you need planning acumen, but you don't necessarily need something like love, right? That's just not specified. That's just not a part of the concept of intelligence or general intelligence. So basically the idea is persons have a lot of attributes that are not subsumed under just general intelligence. But this project is aimed precisely at the idea of replicating those capacities, the ones that make us persons. Yeah. Sorry, I kind of...
No. That's fascinating. Actually, sort of apropos of that, I just There's a verse, I think it's cited in Carl Schmitt's Nomos of the Earth by Goethe, that was sort of apropos the title of this conversation, AI and Religion. And it's something to the effect of him who is forever striving, him we can redeem. And I think that's kind of interesting. So
that's nice.
One of the ways in which artificial, and forgive me, I'm very much a layperson on this, but one of the ways in which artificial intelligence seems to be construed is as a static set of capacities, but not as something that has its own sort of story in the world, so to speak. It doesn't have things that it's oriented towards. It's not discovering in the sense that a human being discovers or adventures or things like that. It's treated very much as a thing that is not changed by its interaction with the world, and is a part of the world only as, I mean, in the same sense that you would talk about a computer that lacked any consciousness whatsoever. They tend to be treated as, I mean, even when the goal is ostensibly artificial intelligence or artificial minds, even as some people will be a bit more open about that. There's still a tendency not to grant it the qualities of a full human being, in the sense of that there's this is one of the reasons why I actually I don't know to the extent to which this was actually intended by the writers, because in fact, if you actually watch the original cuts with the voiceovers, it's terrible. But the original Blade Runner film, this is what I find so interesting about the way in which they deal with artificial humans. And that they're supposedly androids of some kind. It's unclear to me exactly to what extent they're actually androids, not some kind of strange clone in that film. But let's assume they're androids. They're very much concerned with having an existence that's distinct from that of a slave. That is to say, in the Aristotelian sense, they are very much concerned with being full persons as actors in history, things like that. And they make special pains to give these characters, specifically Roy Batty, these sort of poetic, almost like a satanic in the Miltonian sense quality.
Well, that's interesting. You say actors in history. That kind of makes me think of Hannah Arendt's sort of theory of action.
Yes.
But of course, you've read Arendt much more than I have. So why don't?
Well, Arendt is very much taking her concept of, well, I mean, Arendt is very much a reader of Aristotle. So much of Arendt is Aristotle. So, I mean, you can almost just copy and paste Aristotle's conception of the eudaimon, or the virtuous person, and put it there, and add in sort of a more modern concept of history, as rather than simply the world as being this entity with eternal qualities, and like cities can rise and fall in it, but ultimately everything remains the same. Add in history, and you've basically got Arendt. It's Aristotle with history added.
So I hate to put you on the spot, but
Please.
do you? Because I don't really know. I've kind of read.
It's been a long time since I've read Arendt in detail, so you'll have to go easy on me, but please.
Yeah, it's just so what differentiates action for Arendt from? I know she has those there's three categories of human activity. There's labor, work, and action. So what is it that makes action special to Arendt? And the reason I ask is because if she's right that sort of capacity for action is a distinctive sort of human capacity, then I think it's that's the sort of thing that would be a candidate for inclusion in the capacities you would be trying to build into an artificial person. So this would be part of specifying that project. So I guess I just wonder.
Sure. Well, if memory serves, we'll go in reverse order. So labor, Arendt, this is in her book, The Human Condition, Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition.
I started reading it and then I got
it's very worth it. Labor is roughly sort of metabolic activity with the world. So farming, you put in what we today call work, but you put in your labor into the land, and you produce things that you consume, and then once you consume them, they're gone. And so it's a never-ending process. It is the feeding of mankind upon the world. Work, by contrast, leaves an artifact. So the pyramids are the product not just of labor. For the slaves, it was pure labor, but for the pharaohs, it was a work. We use the word work in both a noun, as both a noun and as a verb. So you work to create a thing, and then that thing afterwards is your work. You labor at a farm, but the fruit is not your labor. The fruit is the product of your labor, and that's the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Action, by contrast to both of these, is a free moment of decision. It's very rare, and there are some examples that she gives. The decision to, well, I'm trying to think of a Greek example, but I'll just throw one out there. So again, she's taking this very much from Aristotle. Action requires freedom. That is to say, you are not pressured the decisive pressure to make the decision comes from within you and not from outside. So you are not, you can choose to go to war. Are you choosing to go to war because you have an inner drive towards something that compels you to go to war with this thing, such that you going to war with whoever you're going to war with is sort of an expression of your own nature or your own character? Or are you going to war because your people are starving and they have resources that you need to keep them from starving or to keep your society from dissolving? Or alternatively, is there so much pressure from the rest of your community to go to war that you are forced to against your own judgment? That would be unfree. Unfree would be saying we're going to go fight the Nazis in World War II because we economically have to, or because we have to in order to maintain a global order that we can palate. A free action would be we're going to war with the Nazis because we believe they are wrong. The example that is foremost in my mind is she talks about the Christian concept of forgiveness. So forgiveness is the quintessentially free action for her.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, revenge and punishment.
Okay, look, here's just a really provocative statement that falls out of that is we'd be making the kinds of beings who could forgive other beings for wronging them, right? Like,
well, that depends if it's free. That would be the trick. We couldn't make them to forgive. We would have to somehow make them to have the choice.
Yeah. They would be able to. That's something they could do.
In fact, you know what? Curiously enough, and maybe this is a questionable statement, because in some respects, an artificial human can be designed so that it has fewer material requirements that it itself has to acquire. So we have to ingest water, we have to ingest food, we have to get sunlight, we have to get exercise, what have you. Something with an artificial body may not need to do that at all. They can just go in for a tune-up and whatnot, and they'll rely upon like international systems of trade and all of these myriad resources acquired from all over the globe in order to maintain functionality. But in general, on just a day-to-day basis, in this respect, they would be more free than us.
Yeah, well, I guess according to that sort of trichotomy, they wouldn't be having to spend a lot of their time just laboring so that they can continue to exist. And, I guess it would also even follow from that these beings would be capable of work. They would be capable of making things that you could consider works. So that's interesting. You said something a while back that I wanted to touch on, and that's actually you used the phrase, so the world can sort of touch us and we can kind of respond to it or something. I don't remember how you put it. It changes us.
I see. So when we talk about forces of nature, we talk about them as if they are part of the ambience of the world. When we talk about Alexander the Great, we talk about him in terms that sort of imply that he is something distinct from nature simply. Actions constitute a discrete moment that's separate from the rest of the world, whereas the rest of the world is sort of, in some sense, homogeneous. See what I'm saying? Yeah.
I zoned out for a second, and it's entirely. I need you to repeat that. Sorry, it's just the last.
Sure. No worries. So when we talk about human action, we talk about it in terms of specific moments.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about forces of nature, or when we talk about the activities of human beings as determined by nature. So we talk about human nature, and then you have all these disciplines that treat human beings and the activities of societies and communities as forces of nature. So sociologically, economically, what have you. And the common thread between these is that forces outside of the human psyche, or outside of the individual human psyche, or outside of the human decision, let's say,
right,
determine what these communities do.
Right. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a difference here between a kind of, I suppose, there's a mechanical conception of human action, which sees what we do or how we behave as being basically the causal consequence of the environmental conditions and the organism state, right? So this is basically a reflex arc with some elaboration. So there's some stimulus, which is, some pattern of excitation on the various sort of sense receptors. Then that sort of makes its way up to the brain, and then some stuff happens. There are cognitive operations, and then as a kind of result of that, like a causal consequence of that, the sort of agent sort of behaves. So basically, there's a strictly deterministic mapping from some kind of sensory input to some kind of behavioral output. So there's another way to look at it, and that's basically, we can still use this language of stimulus and response, but we're not going to use them in this mechanical way. So this is why I liked that term. We can be sort of touched by things in the environment. So there's another notion of a stimulus, which is something like, people have used the term activating stimulus for it. So this is something out there that sort of grabs your attention, right? Something that it rouses you. It rouses you to interact with it, to explore it, to seek it out. It could be something like a poem. It could be another person. It could be some feature of the world. But this isn't a mechanical notion of a stimulus as being sort of the input in this deterministic sort of function. So that's the stimulus side. But then the response side would be, okay, so now that you've become aware of this rich environment full of things which are rousing you, which are motivating you to seek them out or pursue them or explore them, you can think of behavior as being a kind of response to these things. So the difference is, so by a response, I just mean that your behavior is somehow fitted to these things. It's like how in response to this pandemic, right? You could just get sick, and that would be like a causal consequence of the pandemic. Or you could start to try to mobilize. You could make sure that people put policies in play to stay inside and not go to work. And you could introduce the CERB and whatnot. Sorry, I guess we're Canadians. We have to specify that's people who are unemployed because of the shutdown are subsidized. The government gives them $2,000 a month. But that's a response. That's an action that is a response to something in the world. It's not something. So I guess it's a different way to think about it. It's not mechanical. So it's non-deterministic.
And I mean, of course, this isn't to discount the fact that there are, even in the formation of your innate characteristics, that such that you can say that such and such an action came from within me as opposed to from without. Of course, obviously, we are products of our environment, and we are.
Yes.
I mean, we're nurtured as much as we are determined by nature, if not much more. So, yeah. So I mean, it's something probably to keep in mind here is that, when we talk about things like freedom and whatnot, you have to be very modest with what you mean.
Yeah,
right?
Freedom. That's a can of worms.
Yeah, it is.
I can say one thing neutrally about that is an artificial person, by hypothesis, would be exactly as free as we are. So whether we're, you know, these libertarian agents who just, I don't really understand that notion, but if we're that, artificial persons could be that. That's actually one interesting note. Oh, sorry.
By dint of being persons.
By dint of being persons, yeah. And there's one interesting note on this. Often this discussion sort of gets foreclosed by people who just say something like, well, you can't create a soul, and we're souls. You can make a body, you can make a computer, maybe a machine of some kind, maybe. But we're souls, so AI is impossible. Well, there's a missing step there. Did you notice it? It's easy to not notice. The missing step is the idea that, okay, if we are essentially souls, maybe we could create souls. Like that, like, and if you think about it, is there some, why is that foreclosed? Like,
well, we do all the time, just unconsciously. Every single human being that's reproduced.
Well, that's another thing. Is there is a sense in which we are the ones who bring about the creation of other persons all the time. It's the old-fashioned way. It's called having kids.
There's a, if I may interject just briefly, there's a really interesting conversation happening in the chat that I would like.
Oh, I have not been looking at the chat.
And the one that encapsulates this is, does a person have to be quote unquote alive or not? And this actually brought to mind not something I've read myself, but there's a Chesterton quote that refers to tradition as the democracy of the dead. So we are already accustomed in many respects to regard people who are not alive as persons. People don't seem to lose, or at least in a folk sense, they don't seem to lose their personhood by not being alive.
Well, they'd certainly lose their agency.
That's true. So that's an interesting question. So what does it mean to be alive in this case? Like what are we packing into that?
I think a person needs to be alive. I mean, they don't, like, they're still going to continue on. We're going to remember this person. We're going to remember them in terms of their actions, what they chose to do, the kind of character that they developed. We're still going to think of that. But I don't think anyone has illusions that they still have agency and they still, because they're dead in the ground. I mean,
true. They are dead in the ground, but I mean, persons, let's say. I mean, the word itself, of course, comes from the Greek and refers to, like, a persona is a theater mask.
Yes.
Now, the theater mask depicts someone who is very much not alive in the story, and quite likely never was alive. So it's interesting that we take our term for sort of the full human being from an artifact that specifically does not refer to a full human being.
Yeah, it's interesting. When Hobbes is talking about this, I think the word is prosopon. It's funny because there's this actual step you have to take, which is, a person can represent themselves. A person can, what's the term? Personate?
Yes.
Yeah. So even for ourselves, it's like there's a mask of ourselves that we have to put on, which is
or we can person other people too. So I can be a person of, let's say, well, here's one. A lot of people conflate the Leviathan in Thomas Hobbes with the state itself. That's wrong. Obviously, the state is not a giant sea monster. The Leviathan is the person of the state. That is to say, it's a representation of its actual character, sort of in an aggregate sense, as it is experienced. And so the actual sort of ontic site of the Leviathan isn't, like, you think of the Leviathan as this giant centralized government, as sort of a folk understanding of Hobbes, but the Leviathan exists in the memory, in the vision, in the fading sense, as Hobbes calls it, in the minds of subjects.
Yeah, this is an aspect of Hobbes where you've got to read from the start if you're going to get the significance of that. There's a reason he gives a theory of imagination before he goes on to the stuff of direct political relevance. But yeah.
But I mean, actually, Hobbes is actually very apropos to this discussion. He is, in fact, talking about the creation of an artificial person, of an artificial man. He's the one.
That's how he opens it. I remember I was so excited when I read his opening to the Leviathan, where he's like, what does he say? He's like, I don't remember verbatim, but
Let me bring it up.
something like literally he says we're trying to create an artificial person. Yeah, could you?
No, not exactly. We're not trying. Here, let me find it very quickly.
It's like the opening of Leviathan.
The introduction, not the part one. Here we go.
Okay, say it.
Nature, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, is by the art of man, as in many other things, so in this also imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. For seeing life is but a motion of limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part within, why may we not say that all automata, that is, engines that move themselves by springs and wheels, as doth a watch, have an artificial life? For what is the heart but a spring, and the nerves but so many strings, and the joints but so many wheels, giving motion to the whole body, such as was intended by the artificer?
Yeah. So I got really excited when I read that.
Yeah.
Because I thought it would be of more direct import, but it turns out that there are two different senses of artificial persons, and one of these senses already exists in like a legal context. You could talk about artificial persons as being like corporations or something, and I'm not as versed in the sort of legal literature on that as I should be if I'm going to be working on this. But unfortunately, that's a different notion from the idea of basically what I'm after. To use this terminology would be an artificial natural person. So they're natural persons in that they're the beings with personal capacities, and in virtue of having those capacities, they're persons. But they're artificial in that we made them. So they're beings with personal capacities created by humans. That's the formula.
Yes. Right, because Hobbes is, of course, dealing with a very impoverished. And this, my reading of Hobbes is that this in itself has a polemical quality. I don't take him to be entirely serious when he does this, but he looks at how communities were when he wrote, and he extrapolates backwards, and he says, judging from how men are now, how must they have been, and how sort of must they be constituted? And that's what he derives if you sort of take the world in which he lives sort of naively.
Yeah.
Maybe that wasn't his intent, but I think it can be read that way productively. And so really the emphasis is on persons, because that is sort of what maintains from then until now, despite the fact that we have a much richer understanding of psychology, or can at the very least.
Yeah, right. That sort of justifies and even necessitates things like the formation of the Leviathan to him. It gives it and it gives his whole system of thought a sort of unity. I don't read Hobbes for his psychological insights, however. As I kind of intimated before, I don't really have a mechanical view of man or of persons. But that's another topic.
Well,
I think the relevant metaphors, or not metaphors, the relevant theories are more organic in nature. And to understand life, to understand animate action, to understand agency, basically the forms of explanation that are going to apply are not mechanical ones. And I can spell that out sometime.
Well, let's do. Yeah, just so you guys know, actually, we're going to start doing this more regularly on Fridays specifically, and we're going to have a couple of other guests that are going to be coming on regularly as well. But we are going to start having I think we agreed on a Friday Shrug.
The Friday Shrug.
The Friday Shrug. Yes. So look forward to hearing from. Look forward to shrugging with Shruggie at least 4 times a month going forward. Here's a question that I think will sort of drive us at something specific to the actual topic of the discussion, which is specifically AI and religion. So just for I made a video on this, but just to give a brief overview. So the concept of religion that we have today is very recent. Historically, the root of the word that we get religion from, religio, has in its oldest sense in Latin, very old sense. So you'll have to do an exegesis of poetry and whatnot to get this. Damn, it's not a Sunday Shrug. We should have done this on Sunday.
Oh, that's brilliant. Dang. Should we do this on Sunday now, just for that?
A Sunday Shrug? I don't know. Are you free Sundays? Yeah. Thank you, Sean, for ruining everything. Anyways.
That's too good. It's both our names. That's too good.
That's too good. Yeah, we have to actually schedule around that name. If we have a Sunday Shrug on Friday, will you guys be mad? Okay. Anyways, as I was saying, so
We'll think about it.
Religio. So the concept of religio had a very indefinite meaning in its original sense. You'll find it in poetry and whatnot. It didn't refer to a cult. It didn't refer to some modern definitions you'll get as a highest concern. It had a very broad sense of a sense of heaviness. So, for example, if you walk in the forest and you feel eyes upon you, a religio may come upon you. A sense of concern, of sort of direness. If you swear, as in make an oath, a solemn oath, the solemnity is sort of scaled in terms of how much religio there is. When you walk into a temple, there is a religio about it. There is an intensity and a weightiness to it. Now, during the and my Roman history isn't great, so I'm really isolated on the religious aspect. But roughly, in Rome, during a time of civil strife, obviously, when Cicero or Cicero, well, I'm going to say Cicero just because it's more common, when Cicero was writing, you saw a proliferation of what we today would call sort of, well, cultic practices and these weird sort of, let's say, weird worships and soothsaying and divination and things like that were seen to be destructive of societal harmony. And so a distinction was made, and Cicero is the greatest example of this. He argues that there is religio, which is positive, which is good, as opposed to being a neutral scale of intensity. Religio now becomes, here is a good form of this kind of intensity in certain things, of concern, let's say, and prudence. Religio can also sort of mean prudence, as in scruples. I have scruples about not doing this, therefore I have a religio about it, versus superstitio. And superstitio is an excess of scruples. So I am afraid of water. I'm wary about crossing bridges because I might fall in and drown because I know I can't swim. That's a religio. I will never cross bridges because I am terrified of falling in the water. That's superstitio. And so when we talk about religio, we're really talking about having an intensity of feeling and focus and gravitas toward or about a thing. And so it seems to me that genealogically, one of the questions we want to ask is, can an artificial person, like, for example, if you were to ask the question, can an artificial person pray? Yeah,
that's great. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what does that question mean, first of all? Like, let's just ask that question.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm reminded of a distinction I heard somewhere between sort of a biological anthropology and a theological anthropology. This is an oversimplified distinction, but I like it. It's useful. So a biological anthropology might tell us things about what we are, or what our material constitution is, at least. But a theological anthropology will tell us who we are. So it'll condition our understanding of where we stand in the scheme of things, whether there's a creator and how we relate to him.
Let's say it.
Yeah, I don't want to.
Well, no, it's just being general. Like, we're not making a statement about that. We're just saying that there's this entity called creator that can relate to it. So we can sort of acknowledge what is.
You mentioned prayer, right? You specifically mentioned prayer. So, I mean, if prayer is a relational notion, which means, you pray to something or someone, you don't just pray like you dance. It's relational in the sense that it involves another entity or being. That's really interesting. I kind of see two, actually, ways in which that understanding of what religion is could come to bear on this. One of them is, do we have the appropriate degree of awe and seriousness and significance as we are trying to create these things? Because I take it this is a very significant and substantial undertaking if we're going to do it. We don't want to be superstitious about it, I suppose, which would be like to throw our hands up and be like, no, like this is evil, this is wrong. But, I mean, maybe it is. It's worth discussing whether it's evil and wrong.
Well, I mean,
it's sober discussion. I suppose having that sober discussion would be an expression of this appropriate seriousness, this religious seriousness.
Well, I mean, here's one place where there is certainly a massive deficit of, let's say, religio about the endeavor of creating AI.
Yeah.
All advances in AI have so far been purposed towards, I mean, insofar as they have been motivated by anything other than sheer scientific curiosity, they have been purposed towards as a substitute for human labor.
Yep. Yeah.
We want to make slaves. What does that say?
Yeah. And that's all they are to people when people are thinking about it, or they are sort of grandiose projects for people to undertake. They want to be the first to do it, or they want to be basically, I don't know.
A word that's been used a lot in circles that I've been watching recently is Faustian. Like,
yeah. Right. Yeah. You did a deal with the devil. But the thing is, you're not doing a deal with the devil. Like, I guess it does sound somewhat serpentine to say, like, if we were to say something like, well, God didn't tell us not to make these things, because literally that's what the serpent said to Eve. Except in that case, didn't God actually tell her?
No, I think what the serpent said, you will surely not die. He didn't deny the order. Well, actually, no, he did.
Didn't he like ask her?
No, it was did he not tell you that you cannot eat any fruit in the garden? That's what it was. And then the second question after is, no, we can eat from that tree. We can eat all the fruits, but not from that tree. Because if we do, then we'll surely die. He said, no, you will surely not die. You will know good and evil, what have you.
Yeah, right. So there was a lie there. Yeah. Well, I think I am very interested in these playing God type objections to this sort of project. And I actually think that taking those kind of concerns seriously might be what it looks like to have this kind of appropriate seriousness that you were talking about. Is there a better phrase than that? That's just how that's the phrase that stuck with me.
Well, I'm wondering, I am wondering about this playing God thing, because obviously there's a Christian implication there, or a Jewish implication, if you will. You're talking about, I mean, to a certain extent, I wonder if that's even, if there's really an analogy there, because the narrative is God created man in his own image, not in his essence, in his image. I'm now, again, I don't want to pack too much into this. It's a very old book with very sort of primitive concepts that are very not primitive in a derogatory sense, but in terms of the development of our thinking about these things, it's very far down
from a genealogical perspective. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. But when we create artificial human beings, what we're doing that's distinct from normal reproduction, which is the conscious creation of human beings, just sexually instead, and we do that with some deliberation. Like we try, sometimes today we'll try to control for certain genetic qualities. People will choose not to reproduce if they have some kind of genetic disorder. They will choose to reproduce with certain people because of certain qualities like high level of intelligence, high income, what have you, things like that they perceive, rightly or wrongly. And so the question is, to what extent is this different? Because it seems like, in a way, it seems like you could construe the creation of artificial persons as basically eugenics at the level of matter.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. It's because, what happens in the ordinary course of things? Two people decide to engage in an act, the result of which is the creation of a new person. I mean, at that extremely general level of description, it's the same with fabricating or engineering, or because I suppose reproduction counts as creating. It's kind of an awkward term, but it's still a term that applies. It's really just a different means of creating.
Well, I think what makes us uncomfortable about applying the word creating to that is that in the sense of when you're talking about creating an artificial person as opposed to sort of a naturally born human, because we're saying here that we're assuming as just a point of, just for the sake of argument, that you can artificially construct something that can be accurately described as human. What makes us uncomfortable is the fact that there is direct and skillful attention at every stage of the development of the artificial human, whereas the natural human is at least largely subject to processes within the body that have no conscious awareness, or that have no awareness placed upon them.
Yeah, because the end result is both an autonomous agent and a work of art on the part of somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
I guess when people are just doing it the old-fashioned way, the only thing they're intentionally doing is, well, sleeping with somebody. They're not intentionally producing a being with XYZ qualities. I mean, well, under some descriptions they are. Under some descriptions they're not.
Now here's a question. Here's a question.
Oh yeah.
Apropos, can they pray? Who would they pray to?
Yeah, that's right. Because I mean, the human case. Well, you have the humans praying to their creator, right? Okay, well, what if the humans are creating other persons? Are they going to pray to the humans? Are they going to pray to the creator of the humans? Because
the Greeks didn't pray to a creator necessarily, did they? They prayed to entities with power.
Who? Sorry. Who?
The Greeks and the Romans prior to Christianity, they didn't pray to something because it was their creator necessarily. They prayed to their ancestors and to gods and spirits because they thought they had power.
So the way it strikes me is that there is something inherently very deeply morally and spiritually debauched about purposely trying to make beings who would worship you. That seems perverse to a diabolical degree to me. There seems to be something like you're being a, I wish a better term was coming to me, but like you're being basically a debauched human being if that's what you're engaging in. You are not appropriately attentive to phrases are not coming to me. How about you say something?
Well, I mean, the poetic example that comes to mind is in Paradise Lost. So during the section in the middle, roughly, where Satan gathers the rebel angels to march against God's throne, they construct sort of a giant tower of sorts on which he is perched at the top as kind of a parody. And that sort of that characterization of that equivocation between Satanism and parody, you see that in things like Lord of the Rings as well. So, for example, the trolls are a parody of the Ents, things like that. The orcs are a parody of the elves, sort of by being the total inverse. And it seems like it's not just assuming that there is some kind of order, some kind of cosmic hierarchy at which a creator sits at the top. It is kind of like creating a separate pole. It's really actually it's creating politics. It's the creation of politics. It's the emergence. It's quite literally the emergence of a center around which walls can be made, as opposed to some other center.
Well, gosh, that's a whole other angle to this, is that suppose you succeed in creating a race of non-human persons, because that's what they would be. They're not artificial humans. They're artificial persons that are not humans. Well, now you would have a race of persons brought into existence. And so, it's kind of up to us how that goes down. Do you want to have a race of persons brought into being that was created expressly for the purpose of being slaves for us? What are the political ramifications of that? That's a terrible idea. Or do you want them to be brought into being, like I mentioned this on the other stream, as a kind of act of love on our part, as a kind of gift to them, like what would be good reasons to do that, right? That's the only one I've converged on. The only one that seems intrinsically good, right? The only one that's not only instrumentally good, i.e., what can they do for us? How can we use them? The only one that seems not awful, if people are going to engage in this project, is to do it for their sakes. We create them for their sakes.
I think the most wholesome example of this, and it's a silly one in some respects, but Data from Star Trek. The distinguishing feature of Data in Star Trek, as opposed to artificial persons in almost every other fiction, is that he isn't utilized for anything. He himself has a job that he chooses to do, and people will actually go out of their way to help him develop for his own good. And what I mean, and here's something that just came to mind. It's slightly unrelated, but it's something that just came to mind from what you were saying. There's a lot of there are a lot of things that result from having a conception of humanity as classified into different racial groups, and there's a lot of debates as to whether or not sort of racial categorizations are valid as means of separating groups of humans from each other in any sort of essential sense. And I tend to fall on the side of being agnostic, almost to the point of negating it, just because there's we just don't know. We don't have the information we would need to make definitive statements about human nature at the level of that thing, assuming that that's even a level that exists coherently.
And if I might add something, sorry, you're finished.
I was just going to say quickly, the creation of artificial persons would be really the first indisputable racial distinction in human history.
Yeah, that's true. That would be an actual case of this is actually for sure a distinct race of persons. There's no, because literally they do not share the genetic ancestry we do.
No.
They probably don't even have a genetic. Well, they might. You might need genes, or you might not, or you might optionally use genes. At any rate, yeah. And another angle on this question. So think about this task of enumerating the things about ourselves that make us persons. Just think about all of the capacities that would go on that list. Okay. Now, are any of those racial categories? No. No, they're not. The personal capacities, the things that matter about us, capacity to care about, having an essential condition, being able to have meaningful relationships with other persons, being a moral agent, a moral patient, somebody who has the distinctive kind of emotional interchanges with other people that we have, people who can be wronged, people who can be honored, people who strive after things, people who care about things. Clearly we share in those capacities, and that's, if we're talking about things that are essential to us, I think those things are essential to us qua persons, and I think that's where all of the interesting action is.
Well, I think that's interesting because this would be a novel application of race, though, in a way, because when we think about application specifically, not conception, because when people talk about race, they'll try to ascribe qualities to racial groups, and they'll do this for particular reasons. They'll want to say something like, this group of persons is best suited to this, and the crucial thing is not best suited to this for the good of those people, or because they have a unique good distinct from other people, but best suited to this because this will cause a functioning society or something like that. And it's the instrumentalization of people by means of that category. Yeah.
That's pretty nefarious.
I mean, people can do this naively, but that's the trend I tend to see.
Well, the instrumentalization term, I think, is the indicting one, because right, I just recall that line by Kant, right? Just never treat persons merely as means. They must, yeah.
There's a very good question in the chat for you, Shruggie.
Oh, we should have a dedicated respond to comments time, because I love comments, but I can't talk while looking at them. So
okay. So I'm going to ask you this one because this is really good.
Okay.
And I'm going to modify it a tiny bit because I have my own question. But here it is. It's from Noah Watson. I don't see how creating an AI with all the best human characteristics is idealistically distinct from eugenics and only a practical difference. Here's the modification. I'm going to ask you, do we have an obligation to create AI with any of our less than ideal characteristics?
Okay, good question. Yeah, well, so I think the question to ask is, so when you're going about a project like this, you're trying to replicate persons. You're trying to replicate personhood. You're not necessarily trying to replicate particular kinds of persons or persons with particular personality characteristics, strengths, weaknesses. I think that, like, I have not even really been considering this idea of creating beings with differential, personality traits, things that, persons differ on. Some people are more extroverted. Some people are, better at math. Some people are, they're like, these are, I guess it would be like eugenics if you were purposely creating persons with certain personality characteristics and purposely not creating persons with other personality characteristics. That would be like eugenics. But I wouldn't encourage.
Well, hang on. Maybe I'll push back on that a little bit. So eugenics is specifically trying to make sure that the genes that are expressed are the best genes. But when we talk about equipping artificial intelligence or artificial persons with the best human characteristics, or at the very least equipping them to develop the best human characteristics, we're not talking about genes specifically. We are inferring a universal human good that is itself not expressly genetic.
Well, I just think whatever the human good is, it's not going to fall along these lines. It's not going to be like the human good is to be extroverted. The human good is to be good at dancing. The human good is to be, to have an IQ around, I don't know, pick some arbitrary number that's higher than 100. Like, I don't think that that's what the human good is going to consist in. I think the human good is going to consist in sort of a flourishing and a perfection of the characteristics that we have in common as persons. And, I'm not like think about it. Like, somebody who is self-actualized is somebody who's sort of figured out, what their distinctive capacities are, and they're doing things in the world that let them flourish, given that they have those capacities. That's neutral on what those things are, but that's what flourishing looks like, or at least vis-a-vis self-actualization. What about, our capacity to love, right? Like, okay, some people are more romantic. Some people are more, I'm trying to think of these. The point is these things that we differ on that eugenicists would be fixated on, like creating differential outcomes with respect to. They're not the essential things, and they're not the things, like, I don't know, they're kind of natural, I guess, diversity.
Well, let's say this, like practically, they're probably not things that you could practically exist without. But if you were looking at a list of things that you had to have removed from your essence, they are things that you could live with losing, is what the geneticists are obsessed with.
Yeah. Like if somebody hit me in the head and I became more introverted than I am, I think I'd still be a person, and I think I could still flourish. It would look different because I would have had a personality.
Yeah, but if, for example, it robbed you of your sort of qualitative experience, that'd be a different story.
Well, yes. Now we're talking about so that's the difference between knocking out these sort of between changing personality characteristics and knocking out capacities that are fundamental to personhood. And when you knock out the capacities fundamental to personhood, I mean, normally we call that death or like some kind of severe impairment. Like, okay, well, what if we just took away his consciousness and you were no longer conscious? Well, then you would be in a vegetative state, and you're not flourishing at that point. You're like, these are points at which you've almost reached a kind of diminished status. I don't
Yeah,
know. That's tricky though. I don't quite want to.
that's very interesting because I want you to sort of touch on this because we sort of come full circle. So there's it's a common trope that artificial persons or robots, if you will, aren't actually alive. But what we've seen here is that what really distinguishes a natural person from these is just cellular metabolism.
Yeah, but you know what? Like, maybe an artificial person would be alive. Like maybe, like I don't know where this comes from. Maybe people are looking at computers and they're thinking, "Well, computers aren't alive." And I guess an artificial person would be a computer. So I guess an artificial
I
person
think
would be
it's
alive.
almost like there's. I guess the idea is it's emergent from matter constructed out of inanimate matter. Like,
Well,
but not entirely
all
clearly.
animate matter is constructed out of inanimate matter.
Yeah, yeah. But like in sort of a limited sense, like you can have the materials arrayed before you and build it with your hands, and you've seen that it's just unconscious stuff. Whereas there's sort of a mystique around an organic life form.
Hmm.
Like yeah, I don't know.
I see a question. Um,
I'm going to excuse myself for 5 seconds, so please feel free to answer the question.
Sure. Okay. Okay. So Raw Coco says, what about the concern many humans have about not asking or wanting to have been born? Will artificial persons not have similar concerns? Why is existence good in itself? Yeah, so that's an amazing question, and this gets at a literature that directly addresses the question of, is it good to create artificial persons? There's kind of a more general question, and that's, is it a good thing to exist? And like I know people gawk at that when they first hear it, but this is an ongoing discussion. Basically, is it better to be brought into existence? We're brought into existence, and there are good things about existing. There are bad things about existing. What about people who wish they were never born? What about people who, right? So how did the question put it? Concerns humans have about not asking or wanting to have been born, right? So that is a question worth engaging with because there are people, they're called antinatalists, who think that it is better not to be born, and that in fact we have a moral obligation to not bring any new persons into existence. Now, typically they're thinking about not reproducing. They're thinking about not having children. But this would be just another means of bringing persons into existence. So, if those people are right, if the antinatalist is right, and it is worse to bring people into existence than not to, and we even have a moral obligation not to bring persons into existence as such, then it would follow that we shouldn't create artificial persons either. So I guess that's an important question to address. And like the reason why I kind of went in that direction where I was asking, where I was talking about creating these beings for their sakes, right? Bringing these beings into existence for their sakes. So it would follow from the antinatalist position that you can't create other beings for their sakes because it's worse for them to come into existence. And so this is just basically a stark difference on that, on whether it's a good to exist, whether it can be a gift to bring somebody into existence, whether it can be an act of love to bring somebody into existence, whether it can be a good to somebody to be created. And I guess I have the opposite intuition that the antinatalist has. I think that it is an intrinsic good to be brought into existence. Now, maybe there are parameters according to which that wouldn't be true. Maybe some aspect of your overall outlook on life would make that whether the truth of that could pivot on your general outlook. But I think that I can at least make a more limited claim.
Well, I think like one of the objections there would be obviously that, well, you can bring someone into existence and then subject them to a life of torture. Now, I mean, this is conflating two things, I think. So you need to parse those out. So you can agree that something is intrinsically good, while also understanding that it can be extrinsically evil as a result of circumstance. So you bring someone into existence is in itself good in that it constitutes sort of a net. I don't want to reduce it that much, but let's accept for argument's sake that's a net, that's good by itself. It would also be evil for the thing that you have created in the sense that you have now originated their suffering.
Yeah, there's a whole argument on this. Somebody asked who this author is. The last name is Benatar. I always say the wrong first name, and I always get in trouble for it because there's like a '80s rock person. Is it
Yeah.
David Benatar? I'm embarrassed that I can't tell you, but last name is Benatar. Yeah, so there's a literature about. So they often use sort of an asymmetry argument, like we have an obligation not to bring beings into existence that would suffer, but we don't have an obligation to bring beings into existence that would have a good life. We just aren't. So there's an asymmetry that they argue. But I'm not super versed in this literature, but I think it's an important one because it centers around the question of whether it is good to exist. And because if it is good to exist, then we can create beings for their sakes. If it's not good to exist, then we can't create beings for their sakes because we're harming them by bringing them into existence. So it's crucial to get that figured out, I think.
Yeah. Here's an interesting comment made by Heisenberg, and I'm going to actually comment on that myself as well. In biology, the qualifications for being alive... You haven't answered this, have you, already, while I was gone? I don't think you did. I think you answered Rocco.
No.
In biology, the qualifications for being alive are usually something like these: responsiveness to the environment, growth and change, ability to reproduce, have a metabolism and breathe, maintain homeostasis, and being made of cells and passing traits on to offspring. Now, here's what's kind of interesting about this. Minus have a metabolism and breathe and maintain homeostasis. And I mean, that one's a bit questionable. And being made of cells, of course. Stars have these qualities.
I think this is like a list of distinctive features of life. It's less clear whether it's a list of essential features of life. Not in all of the cases. I think responsiveness to the environment is essential. I mean, I can't think of a life form that is not in any way responsive to the environment. Even plants. Plants grow in certain directions. They turn their leaves. The ability to reproduce. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I can imagine. Well, okay. There's the more sort of elementary question of, okay, what about infertile beings whose reproductive systems are impaired for some reason? But I feel like I could even imagine if you created an artificial person, you could create them without the capacity to reproduce. And then, I mean, that could still be like, this is possible. I don't think
hang on.
In the world. I don't think it's ever existed, but I think it's possible.
But slow down for a sec. We can't create them without the capacity to reproduce while still maintaining them as persons, can we? Because we ourselves, as persons, created them as reproductions of ourselves. So if they are persons like us, then they would absolutely be able to create themselves in the same way that we created them.
Well, that's true only if reproduction is essential to personhood. Like the capacity to reproduce is essential to personhood. I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe you want to make that case. I think, to me, I don't know, because there are people who are born infertile, and I feel like they're not impaired in the same way that somebody born in like a vegetative state is impaired. Like I feel like they're not, like insofar as they're persons, I don't know that they're being deprived in an essential way, but maybe, I don't know. Like my intuition is that's certainly less of a harm to your status as a person than, even if you were like a psychopath and you just didn't have the range of empathetic responses to other humans. I feel like that would be more of an assault on your personality.
Yeah, I mean, like for myself, I'm thinking like there is human beings aren't always reproducing in the course of their lives, like on an individual level. And of course, there is an absolute limit, whatever that may be, to the extent to which we will reproduce. At some point, it will stop. And so the question is, does humanity as a whole cease to have ever been sort of personified in the event that does occur? Doesn't seem to me like that would be going too far, but you could carry that all the way back and say, well, I don't think reproduction as such actually can be a part of being a person. It may simply guarantee the continuance of a person, and perhaps reproducing in some respect is essential to maintaining personhood after death. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think one theoretical account of the essential feature of life has been given by people who talk about autopoiesis. So that's basically replicating the parts of yourself that are needed to like continue to exist and to keep a boundary between, you and the world. So you could look into that. I haven't really. That sort of comes out of this inactivist literature, and I need to read it, but I find them hard to read. But I need to give them more of a chance. Yeah. Do you want to pick another question?
Yeah, please. So I hope I get your name wrong. I hope I get your name right. Sorry. Gianfranco Machado. The master-slave relationship that would result in the creation of artificial persons would be near total, mainly because I doubt artificial persons are going to be built having the amount of freedom that we have. So here's a question I'm going to derive from that. Given that right now we must be agnostic about whether or not we are physically able to create artificial persons with the amount of freedom that we have, but may potentially have a fraction of the freedom that we have. And since this absence of freedom would, of necessity, mean that we are in the relationship of a master and a slave to them, or something approximating thereto, does that possibly constitute an argument against attempting to create artificial persons on ethical grounds?
Well, I think if we're creating them out of love, if we're creating them for their sake, we will create them in a condition of freedom, just as we were supposedly placed in a condition of freedom.
Perhaps, but the question here concerns competence. So we may be very well intentioned, and we may indeed create them with an aim to them being free for their own good. But suppose we make a mistake, and we've missed something, and as a result, the thing that we've created is indetectably less free than "quote unquote" actual humans.
Okay, so you're talking about the actual condition of this thing.
Yes.
Like I was talking about the sort of social relations that it would be brought into. So like literally like it's beholden to the will of its creators because they have all the power, and perhaps this thing isn't considered a legal person, so it's not protected in the ways that other humans are. That's what I thought we were talking about.
Yeah.
But you somehow this thing doesn't have the kind of capacity for choice, for decision.
Well, just like stepping back, not even that it doesn't, but just that suppose we can imagine a way in which, or we can imagine simply that we have missed something, and that in practice, despite it having all appearances of being the same, is that they're not. And as a result, they fall into sort of a relationship with us that in some way derides or disparages or brings low their sort of dignity in an ontological sense. Does that make sense?
You had me till the bringing them low. How are they brought low? By us being mistaken about their...
Not brought low, sorry, that's too dynamic, but in the sense that they are in fact subhuman.
Well, you said that they would appear exactly the same but be different. I guess I'm influenced by that.
Supposing that they did. I'm just saying, like, suppose that that's like, let's concede that's an active possibility, because look, we can possibly create something that has that even appears to be maybe superior to us in some respect. But what if, like, say, their actual qualitative experience lacks something that we ourselves have failed to reflect upon in our own? You see what I'm saying?
That's always possible, but also consider the way these beings would behave, right? So consider the way. So if they care about things, they're going to act in the same ways we do to secure, their safety. They will get angry at threats to those beloved things. If you see all of these behaviors, which are specified by the characteristics that we take to be essential to personhood, then, I mean, is this a difference that makes a difference? Like, I understand there's a sort of philosophical zombie argument here.
We don't need to go to extremes, right? Like, a philosophical zombie is the opposite extreme of something that actually has maybe true self-awareness or a qualitative experience, in the strong sense that makes us value that and
okay, but I will say that there's no such thing as a self-awareness that, like, would be undetectable, right? If something is self-aware, it's governing its own actions with an awareness of itself. And that is a completely different behavioral profile to a being that doesn't have self-awareness. So it's like you can't really disentangle the behavioral consequences. I mean, that's how I see it.
No. What I mean by extremes, responding to Jama Bayorn, isn't that talking about it is going to extremes. I'm saying that P zombies versus what would the alternative to that be? P person. Speaking of that in terms of like an on-off switch, either you're a zombie or you're not. I'm saying that you can think of that as the opposite end of a scale of awareness, where that's sort of the nil point.
So I guess what this is waiting on is an account of subjective awareness and an account of consciousness. So whether this is even possible strikes me as in need. Before we can even adjudicate that, we need more theoretical resources in our understanding of consciousness. It might be the sort of thing that is impossible in principle. It might be the sort of thing that is possible in principle. I don't think anybody knows. I don't. I think that's the answer right now.
Yeah.
I have the intuition that I think consciousness is functional. So I think that it had like the idea of a being that behaves in exactly the way we do. That's a being who like shifts their attention and it looks at things and it fixates at them and it goes and it pursues them and it feels around and figures out what they are. And then like it discovers what it can do with it and it discovers how that makes them, you know, just imagine a being going around having all these experiences, like doing all of the things that beings who have experiences have, and then saying, but it's not conscious. I mean, I don't know. That's just an intuition pump. That's not a decisive refutation of the idea of a philosophical zombie. Maybe we can go there some other time.
Here's the question. Here's an interesting question for you. How much time do you have left? Because you have to go soon, don't you?
Yeah. I should have left, but I like these questions.
Okay. Shall we do two more then?
Sure. Wait, can I just do one more? I just saw one.
Yes.
It says, is freedom good? And I think that's a great question. Is freedom good? Yeah. This is a question people have been trying to figure out for a long time, you know? So again, I can speak best to the sort of Christian philosophical tradition, but like freedom was supposed to be such a good that God was willing to create beings that would rebel against him, that he knew would rebel against him. And nonetheless, it was worth it to create them because it was apparently worth it to create beings that were free to do anything, even reject and rebel against their creator. So what does that mean? That doesn't supply us with an answer, but that points us to the fact that there have been discussions on this question of whether freedom is good or worth it, or whether beings should be created that have this sort of radical freedom. That literature goes way back, and so the resources are all throughout time and place. So I'm not answering your question, but I'm saying this is an ongoing discussion that humanity has been having.
Can I ask you the last question? Because I've got one that's directly emergent from what you just said, and I'm really curious about your answer. Maybe it'll require another talk, but
sure.
Question is this: so, given what you said, do artificial persons inherit human sin, original sin, and can they be redeemed?
Okay, right. I don't know what I think about the doctrine of original sin. I don't understand what the theological or philosophical rationale for it is. I don't. So I don't feel qualified to answer that question right now. I tend to find it like as a doctrine, it's always seemed to me sufficient to just understand the Christian theological system to say that everybody sins. So it's kind of redundant for us to, also inherit the sins of somebody else. I don't know. It strikes me as implausible. But I'm not actually a theologian, so I don't know what the arguments were given for that position.
Sort of related to the initial question of can robots pray? What are your thoughts or your intuitions about the relationship between artificial persons and redemption in the Christian sense?
Well, I think that if they're persons, then that means that they're capable of sin. And I think that also means that they're capable of standing in relation to God. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, like so I myself am a theist. So I guess I would think that you would be designing beings in the same position as we are with respect to God. Um, and so all of the consequences of that would follow. I think these beings would worship with us. I think, I think these. I think that our whatever our religious capacities are, and you don't have to be a theist with me to agree with this. Whatever our religious capacities are, I think they're at least candidates. They're candidates for essential capacities of personhood, and if they're not, they are spandrels. I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of a
I'm not.
spandrel. A spandrel is okay. So there's this paper by Gould and Lewontin where so there was like these beautiful sort of churches with so the way the architecture is, there are places where arches kind of intersect, and because it's a super ornate old school church, this feature of the architecture has like all this beautiful art in there, and so you can look at them and you can say, wow, it looks like they built these spandrels on purpose. These things are here for a reason, so that they could have this beautiful art. But really, it's just a consequence of the fact that you have two arches that need to intersect. And so there happened to be this space left over. And so they put the art there, and it just turned out being really extravagant. So a spandrel is basically, it's a feature that we do have essentially, but it wasn't put there on purpose. It wasn't put there. It's not like there was, it wasn't selected for. It's not itself an adaptation. But it is a consequence of the things that are adaptations. So I think so does that count as an essential feature of us? It would be a consequence of essential features of us. So I think it either is an essential feature of us or the consequence thereof. And I think there are good arguments that this would be an essential feature of us, which sort of follow from just basically observing human behavior. So we're very motivated and driven to do things like answer questions of existential import. So all of us care a great deal to have a story about who we are, how we got here. We want to know, like, anyone who's suffered a great deal wants to understand why there is suffering to this magnitude and if it means anything. We want to know how the world is going to end. We want to know how it's all going to end. We want to know how it all started. And like, it's not just religious people who care about this. Like, there is physical eschatology, right? And this is a topic of, cosmology. So where the universe originated from, and eschatology, how the universe will wind down if it does. These are topics of huge interest to people who are not theists, and they motivate human behavior. Like we understand our actions and make our choices in the backdrop of these broader stories about who we are and where we are in the universe. And it imbues everything we do with a different kind of character, but stronger than that, it is often the basis for deliberations for us. Like, we choose to do things because we think something about God, something about there not being a God, or something about how the world's going to end. So posterity maybe has a different, appeal to it if you think that the world is going to die in a heat death, and if you think that maybe the universe could go on eternally. And it matters a great deal to people whether these matters are true. And people will spend a great deal of time trying to find answers to them, trying to resolve. When people have doubts about religious matters, that really bothers them, and they go to great extents to try to resolve their doubts. And this is a fundamental fact of human behavior, right? So if you're going to
like we define, one of the common modern definitions of what is religious is that it is of ultimate concern, and of course the older sense is it is things of a certain intensity. It almost seems like the religious is defined specifically by how much we care about it.
Exactly. And what determines our behavior? What we care about, largely, because we're agents. We act for reasons. We do things. We have a striving character to our behavior. It's intentional. We're autonomous agents, and so things like this are like our sort of centers of gravity. These are the things which are at the center of our deliberative processes. And these are the things that motivate us, to like try things, to read things, to stay away from certain things, to explore certain things. So it's a fundamental human motivation. So I think it's a candidate for a distinctive feature of persons. That's what I'd say. But yeah, that's a good place to.
I think so. Yeah. Thank you very much for coming on, Shruggie. I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week. And thanks everybody for watching. And take care.
Enjoy your lives.
Cherish the small things.
Yes.